Hello everybody and welcome to the 2020 European Peace Colloquy webinar series. My name is Ryan Henriksen and I will be a host for our webinar this evening. First of all, a few household items. This webinar will be recorded and will later be published online, and if you do not wish to appear on the recording, you may turn off your video now and also remove your name from your screen by renaming yourself. Please remember to remain muted at all times for the sake of the recording. Second, to ask a question during each webinar, you can submit questions to the speaker by typing them into the chat function. If you would prefer for your questions to remain anonymous, you may send them in a private chat to the host, which in this case is me, Ryan Henriksen. Then at the end of the presentation, I will share your questions with the moderator and the speaker. You can submit your questions at any time of the presentation. A warm welcome to anybody who is joining this series of online webinars for the first time, and welcome back to everyone who has joined one of our previous sessions. The 2020 European Peace Colloquy webinar series is organized by peaceprojects.eu. Peace Projects is a ministry of Community of Christ Europe and is headed by the Community of Christ European Peace and Justice team. Our aim is to provide members and friends of Community of Christ with easily accessible resources, materials, and understanding of peace work in the European context, and give insight into how we might engage in mission together with others. As an online event, we have people joining from all around Europe, the USA, Canada, Australia, and British Isles, and beyond. A warm welcome to all of you. The theme of our webinar series is Peaceful Humanity, a New Creation. We're excited about today's webinar and our distinguished speakers, and we look forward to sharing this learning time. These are the 7 dimensions of the different webinars that we do present. And today's webinar main question is, can peace begin on our plates? Non-violence and what we eat. And we hope to explore the dimension of peace on the earth in our 7-dimension model of holistic peace. Our speakers this evening are Georgia and Ryan Comins, and shortly, Joey Williams will introduce them. And finally, I want to briefly draw your attention to our next webinar, which will be on Thursday, September 3rd. Ellis Brooks will be joining us speaking on Making Soldiers Out of Children is the Space for Peace in Schools. I will now pass over to Joey Williams to introduce this evening's speakers.
Thank you, Ray. It's good to see so many of you here for this webinar series, and I am so happy to introduce our speakers today, Georgia and Ryan Comins. One of the first things that I noticed about Georgia and Ryan when I first met them was that they are extremely good listeners. They have fine-tuned this skill, and I think it's what makes them so insightful when they articulate to issues that they are passionate about, always considering different viewpoints and opinions, but also clearly stating their own personal convictions of where they stand. Georgia is an excellent writer, which I'm sure has been influenced by her love of literature. She has recently completed a 4-year degree in English literature and is now pursuing her master's. Ryan has a wonderful mind and is an excellent moderator. He's moderated several interfaith dialogue conversations with sometimes very heated subjects, and yet I've been so impressed at how he's been able to stay cool, calm, and collected. He is a theology graduate who is currently training to be a religious educator and a teacher of religious studies. I remember first hearing about their passion for meat reduction and veganism as we walked around Dunfield House in Herefordshire. I was impressed by their knowledge, but especially touched by their grace-filled and non-judgmental understanding of what, at that time, was on my own plate. Georgia and Ryan have been living a plant-based lifestyle for 4 years. They've recently moved to London from Cambridge and have taken part in various forms of activism surrounding issues of animal protection. Many of us do not give much thought to the food we eat, yet our everyday food choices can have a significant impact on humans, non-human animals, and the environment that we all share. During this webinar, we hope to explore how making changes to the way we eat and think about food can help to create a more peaceful and less violent future for our world. Georgia and Ryan, welcome and thank you for being guest speakers for our fourth session of the 2020 European Peace Colloquy webinar series. We now look forward to your presentation on nonviolence and what we eat with the important question, can peace begin on our plates? Take it away.
Thank you, Jerry. Hello, everybody. Today we are looking at the link between food and nonviolence and asking this question, can peace begin on our plates? But before we answer that question, it might be helpful for us to tell you all a bit about ourselves and how we came to be interested in this question. So I grew up in the UK and Australia. I was a proud omnivore throughout my childhood with a voracious appetite. I loved virtually all types of food, including plenty of meat, fish, and dairy. And I did not really think too hard about what was involved in bringing this food to my table. However, I was always a very inquisitive child, and I enjoyed learning and thinking about things. Then, when I was 14, I took a flight from Australia to the UK to visit some family members. And since it is a very long flight, I decided to watch a documentary called Food Inc., which is a film which examines corporate farming in the United States. I don't remember too many specific details from this documentary, but I do remember that I saw the inside of a slaughterhouse for the first time. What struck me was not so much the fact that animals were killed during food production, I already knew that. It was the calculated mechanization and systematization of violence. I was shocked by the conveyor belts, the high-speed grinders for small chicks, and the realization that there were some people whose job required them to stand in one place and kill animal after animal for hours on end, several days a week. Now, I didn't stop eating meat straight away, but it did make me think a lot about where my food was coming from and the systematic violence that had been involved along the way. 2 years later, I became a vegetarian, age 16. And then 3 years after that, I began to learn a bit more about the environmental impact of industrial dairy farming and the cruelty involved in all forms of factory farming. I went vegan at that time, age 19. And although the specifics of my lifestyle and my worldview have changed several times over the intervening 4 years, I've lived a mostly or wholly plant-based lifestyle since that point. When I was a student, I also had the opportunity to visit slaughterhouses and to witness the animals as they arrived, which made me feel even more strongly about the issues with our current food system.
I had quite a different childhood to Ryan's in that I grew up in one place, which just so happens to be where practically all my family live. We're a northern family, and due to most of us living practically on top of each other, food naturally has comprised a large part of our family culture, as I'm sure it does for anyone, but even more so when you all live on the same estate. We like to eat lots of soups, stews, homemade pizza nights, chippy dinners, and humongous Sunday roasts. I grew up being praised a lot for having such a good appetite, and my mum loved to brag at how much I love to eat all of my veg to the mums in the playground. Here's just 2 examples in my pictures here of what our dining table would look like when my family got together. As you can see, lots of meat and lots of animal products. As I started to get older, I started to question a little more about my food choices. I got into rock music. Several of the artists I listened to were proud vegetarians. I love to read, and one of my favourite books was Charlotte's Web, where the plot centres on a young piglet by the name of Wilbur and his friend Charlotte as they try to stop the farmer from turning him into bacon by getting him to notice how great and noble Wilbur is. The older I got, the more I started to question more and more the things I'd previously been told to accept because that's just the way they were. It coincided with my starting to have doubts about the religion I was raised in, Mormon or LDS. And I told my mum that I wished I could be vegetarian. As any mother would, I'm sure, she told me I couldn't because Heavenly Father had ordained animals for us to eat, and it wasn't healthy anyway. The kind of questions that I started to ask, however, didn't just go away. And when I was 18, I listened to a speech entitled "The Greatest Speech You Will Ever Hear." Not the best of titles, I would say now, but still. It was by a controversial animal rights activist called Gary Yourofsky. It was the first time I'd ever heard of veganism. If you can imagine that vegetarian was a scary thing to my mum, vegan was unheard of in our household. When I went to our local supermarket to find vegan alternatives to animal-based foods, I found a long-life carton of soy milk and a vegetable oil-based margarine. I was determined to act upon the knowledge I'd learned, though, and the knowledge that we hope to share with you today. So on our wedding day, aged 18, I went vegan, which meant no wedding cake and a pitiful serving of salad from the buffet we'd previously ordered. Since then, we've taken part in various forms of animal rights activism, as Ryan said, and learned to be a lot more understanding and hold a more nuanced perspective about diet than we had sitting proudly on my wedding day, frowning at the people tucking into the cake and meat.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about how intensive animal farming, also called factory farming, harms animals. And I'd like to start by giving you a sense of the sheer scale of industrial livestock production. Let's start with cows. More than 300 million cows are killed for food each year worldwide. So that's roughly the same as the population of the USA. That seems like a lot, and it is. But it's nothing compared to the 1.5 billion pigs, so that's the population of China, that are slaughtered each year. Then, of course, we have smaller animals like turkeys, sheep, ducks and geese, spent hens and broiler chickens, giving a grand total of around 70 billion land animals slaughtered each year for food. So that's about 9 times the entire human population. 2/3 of these animals exist on intensive factory farms, and 72% of European livestock products come from these factory farms. Now let's look a little bit at what the lives of these animals are like, starting with pigs. Pigs possess cognitive capabilities similar to young children. They show signs of self-awareness, they enjoy creative play, and they experience emotions comparable to those of a human toddler. Yet according to the RSPCA, 97% of British pigs spend their lives indoors, and this is a similar proportion to other countries. Although pigs have a natural lifespan of about 10 to 25 years, they're typically slaughtered at around 6 months old. And in Europe, this is usually carried out in gas chambers. Let's look at one more example. Chickens. Chickens are far more complex and intelligent animals than popular culture gives them credit for. Rosa Rugani, an Italian psychologist, has conducted extensive research into animal cognition, and she came to the conclusion that chickens are capable of counting and capable of performing basic arithmetic. They can also work out their own position in a pecking order by observing the behavior of other birds around them. Like all animals, chickens are capable of feeling pleasure and pain, but a 2015 study at the University of Adelaide demonstrated that they can also feel more complex emotions, such as boredom, frustration, and happiness. Yet in Europe, over 90% of broiler chickens, so that's chickens bred for meat as opposed to eggs, spend their lives in intensive windowless sheds, which can house up to 19 chickens per square meter. At just 5 weeks old, these chicks are then taken to slaughterhouses to be gassed to death.
Okay, so we both mentioned at the start of this presentation that we have been involved in various forms of animal rights activism over the past 4 years. Without a doubt, one of the most powerful of these opportunities we had was our experiences attending slaughterhouse vigils. Now, a slaughterhouse vigil is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You get up super early in the morning and travel to a slaughterhouse, which you typically have an agreement with. This agreement means that they will stop the trucks for around 2 to 3 minutes before it takes those animals into the slaughterhouse. No two vigil is alike. Sometimes the slaughterhouse is uncooperative, and activists choose to either stand on the side whilst the trucks drive straight in, or risk blocking the way by holding signs in front of the entrance to force them to stop. In the ones we went to, the slaughterhouses were compliant and would stop the trucks for 2 minutes whilst we would approach the trucks to say goodbye to the animals and take footage or photos of their final moments. I like to think of it as giving the animals at least a modicum of respect during their last moments alive. I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the chickens I saw during my time attending vigils. I have a video I'd like to share at the same time. There's no sound, and I promise it's not graphic, but it does really show what it's like. So they're around 6 weeks old. Their bodies are bloated and much larger than their little feet can stand a lot of the time. Their feathers are ragged and balding in parts, and whilst they often have the large bodies of adult chickens, they cheep like little chicks. The chickens in this video here are broiler chickens. They have been bred selectively for meat, and they are some of the most mistreated creatures in this industry because it is far easier to manhandle a relatively small bird than it is a large cow or pig. They are crammed into the trucks, which tower so high above that when you stand next to them, I had to crane my neck backwards to see the top. They cheep and cluck nervously and defecate on each other for the duration of their journey to the slaughterhouse. There are countless chickens loaded onto each truck, and as you can see in this video, it's hard to see the daylight on the other side of the crates they are in. Now, this footage is upsetting. It's difficult to watch, yet it is the least graphic I could find of the final part of a chicken's life. For me, the most traumatic part of a vigil, however, is not this part. In this part, I am filled with sadness and pity for these creatures. The harder part is when in about 10 to 15 minutes after them going in, the truck comes out again. And this time, it is silent, and it now drips water and chemicals on the road as it drives past us again. The now empty crates have been hastily hosed down. So that's what a slaughterhouse looks like for the animals. But what does it look like for the workers themselves? Who are the people that we are paying to unload these chickens and kill them for food? In my opinion, they are just as much of a victim in this system as the animals, albeit in a slightly different way. Put simply, the workers in these places are often some of the most vulnerable in our society. There's a growing body of evidence documenting the negative long-term effects they have from working in a slaughterhouse. In the US alone, they are some of the most vulnerable people, with up to 72% coming from outside of the US, around 68% of which are from Mexico, and many more are undocumented, meaning they can receive no insurance, healthcare, or sick leave. An employee who works on a factory farm for 5 years has a 50% chance of being injured whilst at work. Now, in terms of health and safety, these workers have very little. In a typical year, the meat industry reports over 200 major injuries and 1,000 plus other reportable injuries to employees. These figures take no account of the underreporting known to exist or of the many other injuries where time off work is less than 7 days. These figures put the meat industry amongst the worst performing sectors of the food industry, which itself is one of the worst performing sectors of the manufacturing industry generally. An employee in the slaughtering sector is 3 times more likely to be injured than the average person at work. Now that sounds rather condemning, doesn't it? You might perhaps assume that this comes from a biased vegan source, which is skewing a statistic to suit their own agenda. In fact, it comes from the British Meat Processors Association, which is an industry-based organisation offering health and safety advice to the meat industry. Another way in which these workers suffer is their mental health, and this was something which the British Meat Processors Association appears to have neglected in their 248-page-long document in which I found the previous quote. They offered a lot of advice about ways of reducing physical risks in the workplace, but I could not find a section about their employees' mental health. Now, it could be that this was in a separate document. I did try to locate such one, but I couldn't find it. I do also wonder, though, what would such a document contain? How do you maintain good mental health when you work in an often windowless room and are forced to spend your days killing in order to earn a pittance of money? These are just some of the headlines I encountered when I searched for articles written about the people who work in slaughterhouses, all of which usually ask to remain anonymous for fear of the repercussions of speaking out. One such worker wrote a moving piece with the BBC about their experience. I won't share the whole thing or read it out because it is rather graphic, but I do think it is important that we address the long-term mental health implications of asking people to perform mechanized slaughter every day of their lives. We owe it to the animals and the humans involved in this industry not to just brush this under the carpet. In terms of money then, what is the cost of killing? Well, according to the National Careers Service, a meat process worker in the UK can expect to earn $13,500 when they're starting out, and up to $21,000 when they become more experienced. These are shockingly low wages, but I wanted to see what it was actually like to look for work in a slaughterhouse. I searched on Google for available jobs in abattoirs and found a load of results didn't even mention what the exact wages would be. In addition to this, I began to spot some rather scary themes in the advertisements of some of the jobs available. In a list of benefits in one such advert, I saw these amongst others. I feel this list offers a far better profile of just how vulnerable these workers often are than I could ever hope to paint. I would like to read it aloud just to focus on it for a moment. A mobile phone discount, help with childcare costs, recruitment incentive, refer a friend, car discount scheme, computer discount scheme, training and development, grocery aid helpline, free English lessons, subsidised meals in the canteen, wages £260 a week, £6.50 an hour, and a 40-hour a week. This quote here by Paul McCartney is a rather famous one that you've probably either come across or have heard something like this before. I find it rather powerful because I would argue that one of the reasons why if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everyone would be a vegetarian, would be that if we saw the extent of human rights abuses that goes on alongside the animal rights abuses, we would all think a little harder before making our choice for dinner that evening.
Another aspect of industrial food production that we think is important to recognise is the structural racism within our food system. In the words of Wilfred Emmanuel Jones, the first black farmer in Britain, when I go to some of these big food companies, it's like going into a white enclave. You think, how in God's name can you be in a city that is so diverse? And then you go into the nearest rural area where you do not spot a black person. And if there is a black person, that'll be the cleaner or the security guard. In Europe, while the land is generally owned by white farmers, much of the manual labour is performed by low-paid migrant workers, as Georgia was just explaining. For example, in Spain, migrant farm workers from Africa, Asia, and Latin America work under exploitative housing and labour conditions to produce food for predominantly white European countries and societies. Racism is also endemic in our food packaging and distribution. Earlier this year, a petition was launched against the Spanish Conguitos brand of chocolate. The brand name means something like Little Ones from the Congo, and the accompanying caricature features a small black character with large red lips. Similar racist stereotypes and associations abound throughout our food packaging, from Eskimo pie and Aunt Jemima to cream of wheat and Uncle Ben's. Moreover, the way that food is distributed under our current system leads to enormous disparities between ethnic groups. For example, in the UK, black people and people of mixed race are far more likely to be reliant on food banks than white people. And I would not be at all surprised to learn that similar disparities exist throughout Europe and indeed throughout the Western world. Of course, these racial injustices are not limited to the animal agriculture industry. They're commonplace throughout our food system and indeed our entire economic system. However, in intensive animal farming, there is an additional layer to the racial injustice, which has to do with animal waste disposal. In the southeastern United States, particularly, there's a major problem with industrial pig farming. The feces, urine, and blood from the slaughterhouses tend to be dumped in open-air cesspools located predominantly, in fact, almost exclusively, in communities of colour and black communities. Here in Europe, the animal agriculture industry has its own problems with environmental racism, specifically against Romani communities. In Slovakia, for instance, slaughterhouses and meat processing plants produce odours and waste, which are then disposed of in locations frequented by Romani people. Intensive animal agriculture also presents a serious danger to our public health. Recent research has estimated that by 2030, the planet will be producing 4 billion tonnes of livestock feces every single year. That's nearly 11 million tonnes of manure every single day, many times the amount of excrement produced by the entire human population. Due to the conditions in which the animals are kept and the fact that they are pressed so closely together, much of this waste contains highly concentrated chemical and bacterial compounds. According to John Chastain, a professor in agricultural engineering at Clemson University, the data indicates that the pollution strength of raw manure from these factory farms is 160 times greater than raw municipal sewage. When this waste is sprayed over fields, the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States warns that chemical and infectious compounds from swine and poultry waste are able to migrate into the soil and water. Moreover, the quantity of manure produced by factory farming is far more than can be used as fertilizer. So the excess is often dumped into large cesspools, as we saw earlier. The waste from large factory farms often sickens the people who work or live near them, which, as I mentioned before, in the United States especially, tend to be black communities and communities of colour. It sickens these people not only by polluting the local air, soil, and water, but also by creating an increased risk of zoonotic diseases. Now, zoonotic diseases are diseases that are specifically caused by germs that spread between animals and humans. Of course, the most prominent zoonotic disease at the moment, the one that's on everyone's mind, is coronavirus, COVID-19. Now, we do not yet know the full story of how this particular virus emerged and spread to humans. But with similar recent pandemics, such as swine flu and bird flu, there is no ambiguity. Those viruses evolved on chicken and pig factory farms. There are also well-documented health risks associated with eating a standard Western pattern diet. Now, a standard Western pattern diet is a diet that's high in red meat, processed meat, butter, high-fat dairy products, and other factory farmed animal products, but low in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. This standard Western pattern diet is associated with elevated risks of health problems, such as obesity, diabetes, and cancer. Overall, the links between our current food system and our public health could not be clearer. Factory farming pollutes the environments in which we live, provides a fertile breeding ground for viruses and other zoonotic diseases, and supports a way of eating that's not conducive to our own health or well-being. On a similar note, we cannot talk about factory farming without addressing the violence that it inflicts upon the Earth's ecosystems and natural environments. Factory farming is a major contributor to climate change and releases vast volumes of greenhouse gases. According to Dr. Joseph Poore from the University of Oxford, if every British household swapped to eating just one more plant-based meal per week, so that's a meal without animal products, it would cut the UK's greenhouse gas emissions by 50 million tonnes. That's the equivalent of taking 16 million cars off the road. As the concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere is higher than ever before in human history, making these switches has never been more urgent. Animal agriculture is a driving force behind deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, which houses at least 10% of all the Earth's biodiversity. According to Yale University's Global Forest Atlas, cattle ranching is the largest driver of deforestation in every single Amazon country. Factory farming also poses an environmental hazard closer to home. A 2019 study found that ammonia pollution is damaging more than 60% of UK land. And according to the FAO, livestock farming accounts for over 60% of our global ammonia emissions. The manure from factory farms produces high concentrations of ammonia, which then disrupts the surrounding ecosystems. Factory farming wastes the Earth's natural resources because it requires vast inputs of water, grain, crops, and oil, but gives us relatively little food energy in return. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that on average, it takes around 6 kilograms of plant protein to produce just 1 kilogram of animal protein. This is because factory farmed animals are fed an awful lot of grains and soybeans, but much of this nutrition is wasted. The animals cannot convert everything they eat into meat because they need some of the energy and nutrients for other purposes, such as keeping warm, moving around the little bit that they're allowed to, making it more efficient for us to focus on getting most of our protein directly from plants. Overall, there seems to be a growing consensus that meat and dairy are some of the most environmentally harmful foods that we consume. The biggest analysis to date, conducted by researchers at the University of Oxford, found that avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way to reduce your impact on the Earth. With a world population forecast to reach nearly 10 billion by 2050, we need to find more sustainable ways of eating. And part of that will have to involve eating more plants and fewer animals.
So that's the really heavy in your face stuff done for the minute. And we just wanted to share at the end just a few quick tips that we have come up with that we felt were like the sort of top, is it 4, I think we said? Yeah, 4 or 5 that we felt would be the best to kind of leave you with today. So first of all, a good thing that we can do is to have an honest conversation with ourselves about how dependent are we really on animal foods. You know, it's not so much, you might look at your diet overall, I guess I'm trying to say, and think, well, it's okay because I don't eat a lot of meat, or I don't do a big portion of this, or I only eat it a few times a week. But often it's in the ingredients in a lot of ready-made food, things like milk, cream, cheese, that all add up to a lot when we factor in just the sheer volume of products that these ingredients are used in. And I found naturally that when I started, becoming more aware and reading the labels of what I was eating and what I was putting into my body, I naturally kind of found myself decreasing from animal products as I just became more aware of how predominant they were in what I was eating.
So a second tip is to try out some plant-based alternatives to animal-based products and meals. I love this tip because it's inclusive. It focuses on adding things in. What can you add into your diet rather than focusing on taking things out, which makes it a lot of fun, actually, because eating plant-based food has never been easier or more enjoyable. Compared to when we first decided to stop eating animal products, which was 4 years ago. It was quite, as Georgia explained near the beginning of the presentation, it was quite difficult, and there weren't that many alternatives available in supermarkets. These days, it's very easy in most large supermarkets to find plant-based alternatives to various types of meat, cheese, milk, ice cream, and also most cafes and restaurants tend to have at least 1 or 2 vegan options. Many home-cooked meals are also surprisingly easy to find vegan and plant-based recipes and alternatives for. And it's important not to overlook the value and the benefits of really simple things as well, like beans and lentils, things which are quite cheap, quite easy to get hold of, that you can easily incorporate into meals as replacements for meat. So yeah, this tip is all just about kind of experimenting, trying new things, and see if you can find some new favorites that don't rely on animal ingredients.
Now, I really wanted to talk about this one. I was like determined to put it into this presentation because this happens to be my favourite brand of chocolate. I think another good tip in helping to combat a lot of the racism and the cultural appropriation and just horrendous packaging that there is out there is to try supporting Black-owned businesses or products instead of their culturally appropriated or racist products counterparts. This brand here, Lucoco, is a Black-owned business, and it has really good, clean, simple ingredients and a lot of vegan options. And they have a shop here in London as well, which is very lucky and good for us. But yeah, just to try looking out and searching online, and that kind of applies as well more broadly to sourcing. If you do choose to continue having some animal products, is looking at where the source is. Is this company transparent? A brand like this is great because if you go to their website, they're really clear about where they get their ingredients from, what goes into making it, and who is involved along the production line.
We're not sponsored. We just really like that chocolate. Fourth, make a conscious effort to reduce the consumption of animal foods. So for many people, cutting out absolutely all animal products overnight is simply not feasible. It might be for health reasons, they might have nutritional concerns, for financial reasons, or sometimes geographical constraints. Sometimes it depends a lot on the area in which you live. For others, going 100% plant-based might seem too daunting or too much of a dramatic change to make overnight. However, many of these people, so if you fall into that category, you may still be able to make a shift that has an impact by reducing your consumption, the level of your consumption. So only eating meat and animal products, say maybe 2 or 3 times a week, and prioritizing plant-based meals and foods throughout the rest of the week. This approach is sometimes called flexitarian, and it can still have an impact and is a step in the right direction.
And finally, just in case anybody is interested in adopting a plant-based diet, or at least, predominantly and pretty close to it, just had some tips that I wanted to share that we've kind of gathered and worked on over our past nearly 5 years now of being plant-based, which is, first of all, the one that I cannot overstate enough, is to learn a little bit about nutrition. This isn't because a plant-based diet is anything big, bad and scary. I think we can all benefit from learning a bit more about nutrition anyway, whichever way we choose to eat. But especially when we're making, a big shift, which it is for a lot of us, like we both said in our introduction at the start, it was a big shift for both of us as well. And kind of following on from that really is to consider supplementing, especially with vitamin B12. That's a key one for vegans. I know that sometimes when people think about supplements, it's this big, bad, scary thing to them, and they think, oh, well, it's not natural and I can't do it if it's not a natural diet. And I think the key thing to remember with this is nothing about our lives is natural today. I mean, frankly, we're on a Zoom call meeting up all around the world, it's not natural. Then also is just not to neglect healthy fats and protein, and to be patient with yourself would maybe even be the most important one. It's a difficult shift for a lot of people to do, and, give yourself the time in that way. And then finally, we just wanted to end by saying, consider attending a local slaughterhouse vigil yourself. They're not big, bad, scary things. The people that run them are often very friendly and really appreciate having volunteers, because there's more safety in numbers as well for the activists in terms of, legal action and everything. And it's a very peaceful form of activism that's great to get involved with. And it might be helpful for you to see it for yourself. You might feel like that's something that you would like to do.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Georgia and Ryan, for this illuminating presentation and some very practical ways to make a difference right away. So I appreciate that a lot. I'm sure there are many questions from the people who have been listening to this webinar. And so I'll remind everyone, you can use the chat function to send in any questions that you have right now. And if you'd like your questions to remain anonymous, then please write those questions directly to El Ray in the chat function instead of to everyone. But while we're waiting for people to send in their questions to El Ray, let's get started with some initial questions maybe for both of you. We've been working in Community of Christ over the last 20 years or so in transitioning from a rules-based tradition towards a principle-based faith tradition. And we know that we can quickly become very rule-based when it comes to what we eat. this is in or this is out, this I should eat or this I shouldn't eat. So is there any type of principle-based approach to our diets and nonviolence?
Absolutely. So there definitely is that kind of tension and the risk when you are moving to a particular way of eating. And I think especially when you use the word diet, people associate it with kind of weight loss diets, things like that. And they want to know, well, what can I eat? What can't I eat? And that's certainly something that even in my own kind of experience of veganism and things like that, that I risked falling into a couple of times. I think you can definitely have a principles-based approach to making food choices, and I would emphasize sort of five main principles. So firstly, kind of knowledge and understanding. Try to find out where your food is coming from, even if it's uncomfortable, because when we're afraid to find out more about the food that we're eating, that's how these kind of problems and these abuses continue to happen. Secondly, courage. Have the courage to make changes to the way that you eat and to your food choices, even if those habits are ones that you've been that are really deeply entrenched in you and that you've been living all of your life. Third, possibly the most important, is compassion. So I think compassion should always be sort of guiding the choices that we make. So that includes compassion for all of the victims of our current food system that we've been talking about today, but also compassion towards yourself, which links into the next principle, which I would say kind of self-care is really important. So look after yourself physically and mentally when considering the food that you eat. And finally, citizenship. So what I mean by that is having conversations with other people, raising awareness about these issues, because it's not one person can't change this entire system. It's a systematic problem, and it requires all of us to work together to try and change the way that we eat and the way that we live.
Thanks, Ryan. Those principles are very helpful, I think. Maybe we can go a little bit deeper into those in a follow-up podcast that we'll do next week. But I want to go back to number 4. You said self-care in that one. So could one of you tell us a little bit more about the mental health implications of choosing a vegan diet, for example? There might be positive and negative sides to this.
Yeah, shall I?
Sure.
Yeah. I have definitely experienced both positive and negative impacts from my decision like 4 years ago to move to a vegan diet. I think in terms of positives first, initially, I don't know whether this is a positive actually, but initially I went through that thing of like, yes, I've done it, I've made it, I'm living ethically now, you can't touch me kind of thing. And that's common. And I don't know, I was just a dumb teenager. I don't know what else to say there. There's no big secret to that. I think we all have a phase like that. But in terms of other positives as well, I really felt like I'd been given a great opportunity to be able to make a more informed decision about where my food was coming from, and that would align with principles I was passionate about, such as reducing harm. That was like a big one for me. I wanted to reduce all avoidable harm. In terms of negatives, like you were saying in yours, Ryan, it can be easy to fall into a sort of diet mentality with it, which is another tip I would have if you do consider adopting a plant-based diet is, there's a lot of weird fad diets out there that will say, oh, well, do this low-fat thing or exclude this group and then exclude that and do this and do that. And I think that can get a bit much. I think you need to have that self-care element. And speaking from experience, I've definitely been there. At one point, I'm sure Ryan can tell you, I went really hardcore and I said, that's it, I'm not going to eat any oil or any sugar because those have a lot of ethical implications. And I did it for about 6 months, and it was just mental torture, because suddenly not only was about half of the supermarket blocked off because it was animal products, you've then got the other half that has sugar and oil, and it can just get too much. And I think the only way you can combat that is by having the self-care element and reminding yourself that nobody's perfect and you're not going to be able to achieve this otherworldly kind of ideal.
Yeah, thank you. Let's check in with El Rey to see if there are other questions that have come in during your presentation and what else we might be able to answer in the time we have left.
Yes, thank you. I think we've had a few questions actually. It's been coming in, and I'll just take a few of those that seem to kind of provide a theme here. We talk about one question is about North America. There is controversy about almond farms, and what are your considerations about these types of comments?
So yeah, almonds are very thirsty nut to grow. They require an awful lot of water, and so they're often raised as, you know, kind of a counterpoint when you talk about how intense, how many resources it takes to produce dairy milk, for instance. Is, well, you know, it takes a lot of water to make almond milk as well. There's a couple of different ways that vegan activists sometimes respond to that. One, a lot of people point to several studies which suggest that even almond milk, which is arguably the least sustainable plant milk, is more sustainable than dairy milk. I'm not an environmental scientist, so I'm reluctant to get too far into the nitty-gritty of that. But I would say that, firstly, if you feel that strongly about almond milk, you don't have to drink almond milk. There's a wonderful whole variety of different plant-based milks. And also, I think that there's so many more issues involved in the production in the dairy industry than just the fact that it takes a lot of water and a lot of land. So I would acknowledge that, you know, all types of food have kind of a sustainability issue sometimes, but we can't kind of get sort of sidetracked into looking at, you know, specific products and saying, well, just because one specific product is, you know, not perfect, then it means that, you know, we don't have to think about these issues.
I think as well, another good thing, speaking specifically about the almonds, a big concern with that obviously is almond milk. Almonds are a very incredibly thirsty crop, like you were saying, Ryan, but you know, I think as well, the amount of almonds that you get in almond milk is relatively little. Generally, in a store-bought one, it's a relatively little percentage. I'm still not comfortable with it either, 100%. I will be honest, you know, and call myself out there. I do drink almond milk sometimes. It's not one that I have often, but I do have it occasionally. Again, just because the mental health element, you know, I'm only human. I can't do everything. If you are particularly concerned about almond milk, though, two great other alternatives that have a very, very low eco footprint are hemp milk. That's a really good one, nutritionally as well, because you get the omega-3s, and oat milk.
Thank you. So another couple of things that have perhaps not been directly addressed with the presentation is this idea about seafood. Is that included at all in the plant-based diet? And what would you say about fish and other things like that?
Depends what you mean by seafood. Every sort of vegan or plant-based advocate will tell you a different thing. My personal feeling on it is that things like certain shellfish, like bivalves, a lot of people, myself included, feel that a lot of the evidence shows they're not sentient. So I don't eat them myself because I think they're disgusting. Like, they just stink and taste gross. But, you know, I think that they class as part of a plant-based diet. Yeah, they you know, they are not considered sentient by a lot of scientific evidence out there. And they're good sources of nutrition. So if you feel like you would like to have some of those, that can be a good way to avoid a B12 supplement, I think, very high in B12.
Yeah. Well, one other thing that I would add to that really quickly is that people use this phrase, the plant-based diet, and technically any diet that is mostly or wholly based on fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, whole grains, rather than animal products, can be classed as a plant-based diet. So it doesn't, you know, it's not just a very restrictive one-size-fits-all way of eating. It's any kind of lifestyle which is based predominantly on plants rather than animal foods.
We use plant-based mainly because we feel that, like, the vegan labels become just too divisive. Like, often you can't have a conversation with people about it if they hear that you're vegan, because it, you know, maybe rightly or wrongly, it brings up too much of a sort of response. But yeah, there is a lot of room for, you know, difference in how people interpret that diet.
And people are asking about good vegan cookery books that you could recommend. Do you have anything like that?
We have a lot of vegan recipe books, mainly because people buy them for us, and I find that we don't use them as much as we maybe could or should.
Yeah, it goes back a lot to my family. We're a style of just throwing stuff in and putting it together.
The Bosch cookbook has some really interesting and some really good tasty recipes in there. So yeah, just BOSH if you just type that in on Google, the Bosch recipe book. But I mean, there's several different recipe books which all have lots of very creative.
Also, to avoid spending money as well, you can just put in on Google. There's lots of really good websites like Minimalist Baker, Hot for Food, some really good kind of recipe blogs that I've used in the past that kind of give me an idea of like different alternatives I can use.
And would you want to comment on the word of wisdom and how that kind of linked to your Latter-day Saint background?
Interesting. Yeah. Do you want me to?
Sure.
Yeah.
Probably go through.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So I was a devout practicing Mormon when I went vegetarian, and it's very interesting how differently people can interpret that document, that second of the Doctrine and Covenants. So I had many people telling me that being vegetarian was directly against the word of wisdom because it has a reference to God having ordained flesh for the use of human beings, paraphrasing. But ironically, actually, the word of wisdom had been in my mind in deciding to adopt this way of eating and to make that change, because the principle of it, the sort of spirit of it, to me seemed to be much more of an emphasis on moderation and not kind of on being good stewards of our bodies as well as the earth. And so yeah, I think definitely the word of wisdom can be interpreted in a way that supports a plant-based lifestyle.
Can I just really quickly, I've just seen on the chat as well, someone mentioned about small open range farming. I just wanted to say that, I'm not here to judge anyone, and I hope you didn't feel that I was, calling out, you or your family for having owned a small dairy. I would just add as well, though, that in terms of practicality, I always sort of wonder what it would look like feasibly, because, small open range farming, would that be possible practically for, to feed our growing population in the world? I think that I disagree with factory farming, but if we want to feed people on, even a reasonable amount of meat and dairy with our size population, I don't know whether we'd be able to do it on small open range farming. That's just, I saw that there, but I'm not an expert. That was just my kind of initial thought to that. I just wanted to mention.
Thank you. Well, Joey, I'll pass it back on to you.
Thank you, El Rey. I have just really appreciated your time, Georgia and Ryan, to present what you've presented. It's helped me at least consider the impact that I can have based on what I see on my plate or what I even put on my plate. You've asked me to question, is what I put on my plate humane to the world, but also to those animals that are being put on my plate and potentially. You've asked me to consider some of the economic implications and linked that with mental health of even the workers working in slaughterhouses. And that goes on to a question of health and wellness, especially for the poor that surround these farms, and really took us into some really great places that we can explore even further in a follow-up podcast that we'll do next week. And that can be found at Project Zion Podcast on Grounds for Peace. So keep an ear out for that. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us this evening, Georgia and Ryan.
Thank you.
No worries.
El Rey?
So thank you, Joey. Just a reminder to everybody about the next session in the series, which will be on Thursday, September 3rd at 7 p.m. UK time. It is the same Zoom link and password. And as I mentioned before, Ellis Brooks will be speaking on making soldiers out of children. Is there space for peace in schools? Ellis Brooks works with Quakers in Britain. A big thank you to Georgia and Ryan for coming, for Comins, for your presentation and for taking the time to be with us for this webinar. Thank you to Joy for those who have joined us on the Zoom evening. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time on Thursday, September 3rd for our next presentation in this series. Although we are ending the formal part of the evening, if you would like to stay on and continue the discussion for a little while, we will, Georgia and Ryan, Joy and myself will stay in this meeting for another 10 to 30 minutes. So if you would like to share a question or comment, please feel free to stay on and unmute yourself when you want to speak. Otherwise, if you need to leave us now, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your week. And we will leave you with this important question after experiencing this important seminar. What would you do for peace?